The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Providence Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches that groaned under the weight of anxious families. Maria Santos clutched her purse tighter as she watched her son Carlos fidget beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the polished floor. The air was thick with nervous energy, filled with whispered conversations in multiple languages and the soft rustle of legal documents. Behind them, a young mother bounced her crying baby while trying to quiet her toddler, who kept asking why Daddy looked so sad. The bailiff's stern gaze swept across the room, ensuring order among the diverse crowd of Providence residents who found themselves here on this ordinary Tuesday morning. Court officers checked their watches, knowing that in moments Judge Frank Caprio would enter and begin another day of dispensing justice with his unique blend of wisdom and heart. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating faces etched with worry, hope, and resignation. Television cameras had become a familiar sight in this courtroom, their red recording lights creating an additional layer of pressure for those appearing before the bench. Producers quietly positioned themselves in the back corner, their equipment ready to capture whatever human drama would unfold today. The gallery was fuller than usual, with curious onlookers who had come to witness the judge's renowned, compassionate approach to municipal law. An elderly Italian woman in the front row clutched a rosary, her lips moving silently in prayer for whoever would need divine intervention today. Local reporters scribbled notes, aware that Judge Caprio's cases often became viral sensations that touched hearts around the world. Social media had amplified the reach of this small municipal court, transforming it into a beacon of hope for those who believed the justice system had forgotten about ordinary people. The wooden gavel rested silently on the judge's bench, waiting to either seal someone's fate or offer them unexpected mercy. The defendant in question sat in the second row, his shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible weight that threatened to crush him. His name was David Martinez, a 34-year-old construction worker whose calloused hands told the story of years spent building other people's dreams, while his own seemed to crumble. The citation in his jacket pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, though it was just a simple traffic violation that had snowballed into something much larger. His sister Carmen had driven him here, her own eyes red from crying after learning the full extent of her brother's situation just hours before. She kept stealing glances at him, wondering how she had missed the signs of his silent struggle. Other defendants waited their turn, some checking their phones nervously, others staring straight ahead with the 1,000-yard stare of people who had run out of options. The tick of the courtroom clock seemed to echo louder with each passing second, marking time until secrets would be revealed. Judge Caprio's reputation preceded him like a gentle breeze that brought both relief and accountability to those who entered his domain. Stories of his fairness had spread throughout Providence's working-class neighborhoods, where people often felt invisible to a system that seemed designed to penalize poverty rather than address its root causes. Today's docket was typical: unpaid parking tickets from people choosing between fines and groceries, license violations from those who couldn't afford car repairs, and minor infractions that revealed major life struggles. The court clerk shuffled through paperwork, each file representing a human story, waiting to be heard with dignity and understanding. Behind the scenes, probation officers prepared reports that would either recommend mercy or enforcement, knowing that Judge Caprio would read between the lines to find the person behind the violation. As the minutes ticked by, an unusual tension filled the air, as if the universe itself was preparing for something extraordinary to unfold. The stage was set for a moment that would remind everyone present why compassion remains the most powerful force in any courtroom. The heavy oak doors swung open with their familiar creak as Judge Frank Caprio entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing behind him like the wings of justice itself. The bailiff's voice boomed across the packed gallery, commanding everyone to rise in respect for the man who had become Providence's most beloved judicial figure. Judge Caprio's weathered face carried the wisdom of decades spent listening to human struggles, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced gaze of someone who could read life stories in a single glance. He settled into his chair behind the massive bench, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the morning's docket with his characteristic blend of thoroughness and compassion. The American and Rhode Island flags stood sentinel beside him, silent witnesses to countless moments where mercy had triumphed over rigid protocol. His gavel rested within easy reach, though those who knew him understood it was more often used to punctuate acts of kindness than harsh sentences. The courtroom fell into respectful silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of papers and the distant hum of traffic outside. "Good morning, everyone." Judge Caprio's voice carried the warmth of a grandfather welcoming family to Sunday dinner, immediately putting the nervous defendants at ease. His Italian heritage colored his speech with subtle inflections that reminded the diverse community of Providence that he was one of them, not some distant figure of authority. The clerk handed him the first file, and he opened it with the careful attention of someone who understood that each case represented real consequences for real people. David Martinez, case number 2024 TF 8847, failure to pay parking violations and driving with a suspended license, he read aloud, his tone neutral but not unkind. The cameras focused on both the judge and the defendant as David slowly rose from his seat, his legs unsteady beneath him, like a man walking toward an uncertain future. His sister Carmen squeezed his shoulder gently, whispering a prayer under her breath as her brother made his way to the defendant's podium. The distance from his seat to the front of the courtroom felt like miles, each step echoing in the suddenly quiet space. David approached the podium with the hesitant gait of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from institutions and authority figures. His work boots, scuffed from years of construction sites, seemed out of place on the polished courtroom floor. Yet Judge Caprio's expression remained welcoming and patient. "Mr. Martinez, I see here you have several unpaid parking tickets dating back 8 months, and you were caught driving with a suspended license last week," the judge said, his voice carrying no judgment, only the facts as they appeared on paper. David's hands gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles white with tension as he nodded silently, unable to find words that could possibly explain his situation. The prosecutor, a young woman in a crisp suit, shuffled her own papers, prepared to argue for the standard penalties that would likely crush this man's already fragile financial situation. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his experienced eyes detecting something in the defendant's posture that suggested there was more to this story than simple negligence. The stage was set for what appeared to be a routine case of municipal violations, yet something in the air suggested nothing about this morning would be ordinary. The charges seemed straightforward enough. 840 fellows in unpaid parking tickets, driving on a suspended license, and failure to appear at a previous hearing. Judge Caprio had seen hundreds of similar cases, usually involving people caught between impossible choices and unforgiving deadlines. "Mr. Martinez, before we proceed, I want you to know that this court believes in treating everyone with dignity and respect," the judge said, his words carrying the weight of a personal promise rather than legal boilerplate. David looked up for the first time, surprise flickering across his weathered features at the unexpected kindness in the judge's voice. The cameras captured this moment of human connection, the split second when a man who expected condemnation instead found compassion waiting for him. Around the courtroom, other defendants watched with growing hope, recognizing themselves in David's struggle and wondering if they too might find mercy rather than punishment. What none of them could anticipate was that this ordinary case was about to become an extraordinary testament to the power of human empathy in the halls of justice. David Martinez stood at the podium like a man carrying the weight of unspoken sorrows, his shoulders curved inward as if protecting himself from another blow that life might deliver. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, avoiding the compassionate gaze of Judge Caprio and the curious stares of the packed courtroom behind him. The fluorescent lights above seemed harsh against his olive complexion, highlighting the deep lines that had appeared around his eyes over the past year, aging him beyond his 34 years. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket, fumbling for the crumpled citation that had brought him here today. Those who knew David from the construction sites would hardly recognize this broken version of the man who once arrived at work, singing Spanish folk songs and sharing his lunch with anyone who looked hungry. His work boots, usually polished despite their age, were now scuffed and worn, telling the story of a man too exhausted to care about appearances. The confident posture of a skilled craftsman had been replaced by the hunched stance of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from every corner of life. Judge Caprio had presided over thousands of cases, but something about David's demeanor immediately caught his attention, triggering the judicial instincts he had honed over decades on the bench. The way David's jaw clenched and unclenched suggested he was fighting back emotions that threatened to overwhelm him at any moment. His breathing was shallow and controlled, the careful rhythm of someone who had taught himself not to feel too deeply because the pain had become unbearable. When asked to state his name for the record, David's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, forcing the court reporter to lean forward to catch his words. The judge noticed how David's eyes kept darting toward the exit, not with the defiance of someone planning to run, but with the desperate hope of someone who wished he could disappear entirely. Even his sister Carmen, sitting in the gallery, could see that her brother was fighting an internal battle that had nothing to do with parking tickets or suspended licenses. The man standing before the court was clearly carrying a burden far heavier than any legal penalty could impose. The prosecutor began reading the charges, her voice crisp and professional, but David seemed to barely register her words, lost in some private anguish that consumed his attention. His hands, scarred from years of honest labor, gripped the podium with such intensity that his knuckles had turned white, as if holding on was the only thing preventing him from completely falling apart. Occasionally, he would swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort of keeping his composure in a room full of strangers and cameras. The practiced eye of Judge Caprio recognized the signs of a man on the edge, someone whose current troubles were merely symptoms of a much deeper wound. David's clothes, though clean, hung loosely on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss that spoke of sleepless nights and forgotten meals. His wedding ring, still visible on his left hand, caught the courtroom lights, a small detail that made several observers wonder about the family circumstances that might be contributing to his obvious distress. Something fundamental had changed in this man's life, and whatever it was had left him looking like a shadow of his former self. As the morning light shifted through the courtroom windows, it illuminated David's profile, revealing tear tracks that he had tried to wipe away before entering the building. His breathing became more labored as the proceedings continued, and those closest to him could see his hands beginning to shake with increasing intensity. Judge Caprio paused in his review of the paperwork, his compassionate instincts telling him that this case required a different approach than the standard legal procedures. The defendant before him wasn't just another person who had fallen behind on municipal fines. This was someone whose very soul appeared to be crying out for help. David's sister Carmen clutched her rosary tighter, recognizing the signs of her brother's internal struggle, and praying that somehow this kind judge would see past the legal paperwork to the human being who desperately needed understanding. The cameras continued rolling, unknowingly documenting the moments before a revelation that would transform an ordinary Tuesday morning into something extraordinary. In the growing silence of the courtroom, everyone could sense that David Martinez was carrying a secret so heavy it threatened to crush him entirely. Judge Frank Caprio leaned back in his chair, his experienced eyes studying David Martinez with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read human suffering in all its forms. Over 3 decades on the bench had taught him that the most important stories were often hidden beneath the surface of legal documents and municipal violations. The way David avoided eye contact, the tremor in his hands, the obvious weight loss, these were not the signs of simple financial irresponsibility, but of profound personal crisis. Judge Caprio had seen enough broken people pass through his courtroom to recognize when someone was drowning in circumstances beyond their control. His own grandfather's stories of immigrant struggles had instilled in him a deep understanding that sometimes people's worst moments revealed their greatest need for compassion. The judge closed the file momentarily, setting aside the cold facts and figures to focus on the human being standing before him. Something in his gut, honed by years of dispensing justice with mercy, told him this case would require more than standard judicial procedure. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Caprio said gently, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him beloved throughout Providence's working-class neighborhoods. "Before we discuss these citations, I want you to know that this court is interested in understanding your situation, not just punishing violations." David's head lifted slightly at the unexpected kindness, hope flickering briefly in his tired eyes before he looked down again, as if afraid to believe that mercy might be possible. The judge noticed how David's breathing changed, becoming more rapid and shallow, suggesting that even this small gesture of humanity was threatening to crack the emotional dam he had built around his pain. Judge Caprio had learned long ago that the most effective justice came not from the gavel, but from genuine human connection and understanding. His Italian heritage had taught him that family problems were community problems, and community problems required community solutions. The packed courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that their beloved judge was about to demonstrate once again why his reputation for compassion extended far beyond Providence's city limits. Even the cameras seemed to adjust their focus, as if the operators sensed something significant was about to unfold. The judge's intuition, sharpened by decades of seeing people at their lowest moments, detected layers of anguish beneath David's obvious financial troubles. Judge Caprio had presided over cases involving single mothers choosing between rent and car insurance, elderly citizens rationing medication to pay fines, and working fathers taking second jobs just to keep their families afloat. But David's demeanor suggested something even more devastating, the kind of loss that strips away a person's will to fight for themselves. The way he stood, the slope of his shoulders, the careful control of his breathing, all pointed to someone who was fighting just to remain standing in this moment. Judge Caprio recognized the signs of a man who had been hollowed out by tragedy, leaving only the shell of who he used to be. His years of experience had taught him that behind every unpaid fine was a human story, and behind every human story was an opportunity to either restore dignity or destroy what remained of a person's hope. The judge made a decision that would define not just this case, but this moment in the lives of everyone present. "David," Judge Caprio said, using the defendant's first name with deliberate intention, "I can see that you're struggling with something much bigger than parking tickets." The simple acknowledgement of his humanity caused David's carefully constructed composure to begin cracking, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled emotion. The judge had learned to trust his instincts about people, and every fiber of his being told him that this man was carrying a burden that would break most people entirely. Judge Caprio's own experiences as a father and grandfather had taught him to recognize the particular kind of pain that comes from watching someone you love suffer beyond your ability to help them. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the sound of David's ragged breathing was audible to those in the front rows, creating an intimacy that transcended the formal boundaries of legal proceedings. Even the prosecutor sensed the shift in atmosphere, her prepared arguments suddenly seeming inadequate for whatever truth was about to emerge. Judge Caprio's reputation had been built on moments exactly like this one, when judicial wisdom gave way to human compassion and the courtroom became a place of healing rather than mere punishment. David Martinez's carefully constructed emotional barriers finally began to crumble under the weight of Judge Caprio's genuine compassion, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as he fought to maintain control. The simple act of being seen as a human being rather than just another case number had opened a floodgate of pain that he had been desperately trying to contain for months. His hands gripped the podium so tightly that the wood seemed to groan under the pressure, while his eyes darted frantically between the floor and the judge's patient face. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, I haven't been able to focus on anything since." The words caught in his throat like broken glass, each syllable requiring tremendous effort to speak aloud. Judge Caprio leaned forward encouragingly, his expression radiating the kind of paternal warmth that made confessing painful truths feel safe rather than shameful. The entire courtroom held its collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness something profound and deeply personal. "My daughter Emma," David continued, his voice breaking on her name as tears finally began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "She's only 7 years old, and 6 months ago she was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, striking everyone in the courtroom with the devastating force of unimaginable parental anguish. His sister Carmen let out a soft sob from the gallery, covering her mouth as her own tears began to flow, remembering her beautiful niece who used to dance around construction sites when David brought her to work on Saturdays. The prosecutor's prepared arguments died on her lips as she witnessed the raw pain of a father whose world had been shattered by the cruelest possible twist of fate. Judge Caprio's own eyes filled with tears, his decades of judicial experience providing no protection against the pure agony of a parent facing every parent's worst nightmare. The cameras continued rolling, unknowingly capturing one of the most heartbreaking moments ever recorded in a municipal courtroom. Even the bailiffs, trained to maintain professional detachment, found themselves struggling to maintain their composure in the face of such devastating revelation. "The doctors say she has maybe 3 months left," David whispered, his words barely audible as his entire body began to shake with suppressed sobs. "I've been sleeping at the hospital every night, taking care of her during her treatments, and I completely forgot about everything else. The parking tickets, the court dates, even paying bills." His confession poured out like water from a broken dam, months of isolation and despair finally finding voice in the safety of Judge Caprio's compassionate courtroom. The assembled crowd could hear the sound of tissues being pulled from purses and pockets as David's story touched every parent, grandparent, and human being present. His work boots, scuffed from running between hospital corridors and construction sites, told the story of a man trying to be everywhere at once while watching his daughter slip away. Judge Caprio struggled to maintain his own composure, thinking of his own grandchildren and the impossible choices this father had been forced to make. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to dim in the face of such overwhelming human suffering. "I just want to spend every minute I can with her," David continued, his voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. "Some days she asks me why I look so sad, and I try to smile for her. But, Your Honor, I'm dying inside watching my little girl fight this battle. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of quiet crying from the gallery, where strangers found themselves united in shared heartbreak for a man they had never met. Judge Caprio removed his glasses and wiped his own eyes, his judicial training warring with his instincts as a father and grandfather who understood that some pain transcends all earthly authority. David's wedding ring caught the light as he wiped his face, and those watching realized that he was not only facing the loss of his daughter, but carrying this burden while trying to support his wife through the same unimaginable grief. The parking tickets and suspended license suddenly seemed monumentally insignificant compared to the crushing weight of watching a child slip away despite every prayer, every treatment, and every desperate bargain with God. In this moment, everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just a legal proceeding, but a father's broken heart laid bare before the world. The revelation of Emma's terminal diagnosis created a profound silence that seemed to suspend time itself within the sacred walls of the Providence Municipal Court. Every person present, from seasoned court officers to first-time defendants, found themselves frozen in a moment of shared human anguish that transcended all social boundaries. The prosecutor's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table as she struggled to process the devastating reality that this simple traffic case had just revealed. Judge Caprio sat motionless behind his bench, his weathered hands clasped tightly together as he fought to maintain judicial composure while his grandfather's heart broke for this suffering father. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, tears blurring her vision as she realized she was documenting one of the most heartbreaking moments in the court's long history. Camera operators found themselves discreetly wiping their eyes behind their equipment, their professional objectivity crumbling in the face of such raw human pain. Even the flags seemed to droop with the weight of collective sorrow that had descended upon everyone present. In the gallery, Carmen Martinez buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs as she remembered her vibrant niece Emma, who just months ago had been planning her 8th birthday party and dreaming of becoming a veterinarian. Other defendants waiting their turn found themselves thinking of their own children, grandchildren, and loved ones, suddenly grateful for problems that had seemed insurmountable just moments before. An elderly woman in the front row clutched her rosary so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, whispering prayers in Italian for a little girl she had never met, but whose struggle had become everyone's burden. The young mother with the crying baby instinctively pulled her children closer, tears streaming down her face as she imagined the unthinkable horror David was living through every day. Court officers, who had maintained professional stoicism through decades of human drama, found themselves struggling to maintain their composure in the presence of such profound parental anguish. The very air in the courtroom seemed heavy with the collective weight of hearts breaking for a 7-year-old girl fighting an impossible battle and her father who was slowly dying alongside her. Television producers in the back corner of the courtroom exchanged glances, knowing they were witnessing something far more powerful than typical judicial proceedings. This was pure human truth laid bare before the world. The cameras continued rolling, but everyone behind them understood that they were no longer documenting a legal case, but rather capturing a moment of shared humanity that would touch hearts across the globe. Social media notifications seemed trivial and irrelevant as everyone present grappled with the stark reality that while they had been worried about traffic fines and minor violations, this man had been watching his daughter slip away. The morning's docket of cases suddenly felt meaningless compared to the cosmic injustice of a 7-year-old child facing terminal cancer, while her father stood accused of neglecting parking tickets. Local reporters put down their pens, recognizing that some stories were too sacred to be reduced to simple news coverage. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to the human drama unfolding below, their harsh glare seeming almost disrespectful in the presence of such profound grief. Time itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how justice would respond to a pain that no law could address and no sentence could heal. Judge Caprio slowly rose from his chair, the movement causing every eye in the courtroom to focus on him as he prepared to respond to a situation that no judicial training could have prepared him for. His black robes, symbols of legal authority and impartial justice, suddenly seemed inadequate for a moment that demanded not judgment but profound human compassion. The wooden gavel on his desk remained untouched, its power to render legal decisions completely overshadowed by the need for something far more healing than any court could traditionally provide. David continued to stand at the podium, his tears flowing freely now, no longer caring about maintaining composure in a room full of strangers because his secret was finally free. The courtroom clock ticked steadily onward, marking seconds that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives as the moment they witnessed pure human vulnerability in its most heartbreaking form. Behind the bench, Judge Caprio's own eyes filled with tears as he contemplated how to respond to a father's agony with the dignity and compassion that both David and his dying daughter deserved. The stage was set for a response that would either restore faith in human kindness or demonstrate the cold limitations of institutional justice. Judge Caprio stepped down from his elevated bench, abandoning the traditional barriers between judge and defendant as he approached David with the gentle urgency of a father responding to another father's unbearable pain. The unprecedented action sent ripples of surprise through the courtroom, as decades of formal protocol gave way to pure human compassion in its most authentic form. "David," he said softly, placing a comforting hand on the grieving man's shoulder, "I am so deeply sorry for what you and your family are enduring." His voice carried the weight of personal understanding, drawing from his own experiences as a father and grandfather who could barely comprehend such devastating loss. The cameras captured this extraordinary moment when judicial authority transformed into paternal embrace, documenting compassion that transcended every legal boundary. Court officers watched in respectful silence as their beloved judge demonstrated once again why his reputation for mercy had spread far beyond Providence's borders. The entire courtroom witnessed something unprecedented, justice removing its formal robes to reveal the beating heart beneath. "Your parking tickets, your suspended license, none of that matters right now," Judge Caprio declared, his voice gaining strength as he made a decision that would define his legacy. "What matters is that you're here fighting for your daughter, being the father she needs during the most difficult time imaginable." He turned toward his clerk, issuing instructions that would forever change David's legal situation. "Dismiss all charges immediately and expunge his record completely." The prosecutor nodded through her tears, understanding that some moments transcended legal precedent and demanded human decency above all else. Judge Caprio reached into his own wallet, pulling out several bills as he continued, "And I want you to take this money, not as charity, but as one father helping another during an impossible time." His gesture sparked a movement throughout the courtroom as other observers began reaching for their own wallets, purses, and phones to organize support for Emma's family. The wooden podium that had earlier seemed like a defendant's dock had transformed into a rallying point for community compassion. "Furthermore," Judge Caprio announced, turning to address the packed courtroom, "I want everyone here to understand what real courage looks like." His voice carried across every corner of the room, reaching hearts that had been touched by David's devastating revelation and transformed by witnessing authentic leadership in action. This man has been carrying an unimaginable burden while still showing up, still trying to handle his responsibilities, still being present for his daughter. The judge's words elevated David from defendant to hero, reframing his story as one of extraordinary strength rather than legal failure. Carmen wept openly in the gallery, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from shame to recognition of her brother's incredible sacrifice and determination. Other defendants found themselves inspired by David's example, recognizing that their own struggles, while significant, paled in comparison to watching a child battle terminal cancer. Judge Caprio's response had transformed the courtroom from a place of judgment into a sanctuary of understanding and support. "David, I want you to go home to Emma and spend every precious moment with her," Judge Caprio continued, his words carrying the authority of judicial decree and the tenderness of grandfatherly advice. "Don't worry about these legal matters. They're resolved, and they should never have been your concern while you're fighting this battle." He gestured toward the cameras, knowing that this moment would reach millions of viewers who needed to witness what true justice looked like when it was guided by love rather than law. The judge's decision to dismiss all charges and provide financial support had created a ripple effect throughout the courtroom, inspiring others to offer their own assistance and prayers. His response demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful legal ruling was the decision to set aside legal rules entirely in favor of human decency. The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed brighter now, illuminating not just a courtroom, but a community united in support of one family's impossible journey. Judge Caprio had shown everyone present that true authority came not from the power to punish, but from the wisdom to know when mercy was the highest form of justice. The extraordinary display of compassion from Judge Caprio created an immediate chain reaction throughout the packed courtroom, as strangers became united in their desire to support David and his dying daughter, Emma. Carmen Martinez rushed from the gallery to embrace her brother, her tears mixing with his as she whispered prayers of gratitude for the kindness they had just witnessed. The elderly Italian woman in the front row approached the bailiff, pressing a crumpled $20 bill into his hands with instructions to give it to that poor father for his little girl. Other defendants began reaching into their pockets, pulling out whatever money they could spare, transforming the formal courtroom into an impromptu fundraising effort. The young mother with her children wrote David's name on a piece of paper, promising to organize meal deliveries through her church community. Court officers, typically trained to maintain emotional distance, found themselves discreetly wiping their eyes while helping to collect donations from the growing crowd of supporters. What had begun as one judge's act of mercy had ignited a wildfire of human kindness that consumed everyone present. The prosecutor, visibly moved by the morning's events, approached David with her business card and the contact information for a children's cancer charity that provided financial assistance to families facing terminal diagnoses. "My sister went through something similar," she whispered, her professional composure completely abandoned in favor of human connection. Local reporters put away their notebooks, understanding that their role had shifted from documenting legal proceedings to witnessing a community rally around one of its own. The court clerk began making phone calls, reaching out to local businesses and organizations that had previously supported families in crisis. Even the television producers found themselves discussing how to use their platform to raise additional funds and awareness for Emma's medical expenses. The camera operators continued filming, but now they were capturing something far more powerful than typical courtroom drama. They were documenting the birth of a grassroots movement of compassion. The formal boundaries between court personnel, defendants, and observers had completely dissolved, replaced by a shared sense of purpose and humanity. Social media notifications began lighting up phones throughout the courtroom as word of Judge Caprio's extraordinary response spread beyond the physical walls of Providence Municipal Court. The hashtag One Emma Strong began trending within minutes, as viewers who had been watching the live stream started organizing their own fundraising efforts and prayer chains. Local news stations interrupted regular programming to cover the developing story, understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended typical judicial proceedings. Carmen's phone began ringing with calls from friends, neighbors, and complete strangers who had heard about Emma's story and wanted to help in any way possible. The courthouse steps became an impromptu gathering place as people who had been in the courtroom continued organizing support efforts and sharing contact information. Construction workers from David's job site began arriving, having heard the news through their network of colleagues who understood the bond between working men facing impossible circumstances. The ripple effect had grown from a single act of judicial mercy into a community-wide mobilization of support for one family's desperate battle. Judge Caprio watched from behind his bench as the courtroom transformed into something unprecedented in his decades of service, a living testament to the power of compassion to inspire extraordinary human response. The scheduled docket of cases seemed trivial compared to the organizing efforts now taking place throughout the room, as strangers exchanged phone numbers and made plans to support Emma's family. Local businesses began calling the court clerk, offering everything from free meals to transportation assistance for David's trips to the children's hospital. The bailiff found himself serving as an unofficial coordinator for the growing relief effort, his uniform pockets filling with business cards and donation envelopes. Carmen stood surrounded by new friends, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and struggling to process how quickly their nightmare had been transformed into a story of community solidarity. The judge's decision to show mercy had unleashed something beautiful and unstoppable, the collective power of human hearts choosing love over indifference. By noon, what had started as one man's legal troubles had become an entire city's mission to ensure that no family would face such tragedy alone. By evening, the story of Judge Caprio's extraordinary act of compassion had spread across Providence like wildfire, reaching every neighborhood where working families understood the impossible choices David Martinez had been forced to make. Local television stations led their evening broadcasts with footage of the emotional courtroom scene, while radio hosts dedicated entire call-in shows to listeners sharing their own stories of community support during times of crisis. The Martinez family's modest home was surrounded by neighbors bringing casseroles, flowers, and handwritten notes of encouragement, transforming their quiet street into a hub of collective caring. Emma's elementary school organized a fundraising drive, with her second-grade classmates creating colorful drawings and cards to decorate her hospital room. The construction company where David worked established a relief fund, with his co-workers contributing vacation days and overtime hours to ensure he could remain by his daughter's side. Carmen found herself coordinating donations and volunteer schedules from her kitchen table, amazed by the generosity of people who had never met her family but felt compelled to help. The ripple effect had grown beyond anything anyone could have imagined when the day began with simple parking violations. Social media platforms exploded with shares of the courtroom video, accumulating millions of views as people around the world witnessed authentic compassion in action. The hashtag #EmmaStrong became a global phenomenon, with donations pouring in from as far away as Japan and Brazil, proving that human kindness recognizes no geographical boundaries. Major news networks picked up the story, interviewing child psychology experts about the importance of keeping families together during terminal illness diagnoses. GoFundMe campaigns organized by strangers raised tens of thousands of dollars within hours, while local pediatric cancer organizations reported record-breaking donation spikes. Celebrity influencers began sharing Emma's story, using their platforms to amplify the message that every child deserves to spend their final months surrounded by love rather than financial worry. The children's hospital where Emma was receiving treatment reported an unprecedented number of volunteers signing up to support other families facing similar battles. What had started as one judge's decision to show mercy had evolved into a global movement celebrating the power of human compassion over institutional indifference. David returned to the hospital that afternoon, carrying a bag filled with toys, books and games donated by the courthouse community, his face bearing a mixture of grief and overwhelming gratitude. Emma's medical team noticed an immediate change in her father's demeanor as the crushing weight of financial stress had been lifted from his shoulders, allowing him to focus entirely on being present for his daughter. The hospital social worker helped the family navigate their newfound resources, ensuring that donated funds would be properly allocated to medical expenses, transportation, and basic living costs. Other families in the pediatric wing began approaching David, having heard his story from nurses and wanting to understand how their community could rally around them as well. The child life specialists incorporated Emma's story into their training materials, using it as an example of how community support could dramatically improve a family's ability to cope with terminal diagnosis. Carmen took a leave of absence from her own job, dedicating herself full-time to managing the overwhelming response and ensuring that her brother could focus exclusively on Emma's care. The transformation was remarkable. A family that had been drowning in despair and isolation now found themselves buoyed by an ocean of love and practical support. The Providence Municipal Court itself became a destination for visitors wanting to witness the place where such extraordinary compassion had been displayed, with the courthouse steps becoming an impromptu shrine of flowers and thank-you notes. Judge Caprio received thousands of emails and letters from around the world, with many sharing their own stories of loss, hope, and the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. The court's social media channels were flooded with messages of gratitude, while legal professionals across the country began discussing how compassion could be better integrated into judicial proceedings. Local law schools invited Judge Caprio to speak about the role of empathy in justice, understanding that his response had created a teaching moment about the true purpose of legal institutions. The story inspired other judges to examine their own practices, leading to policy discussions about how courts could better serve families facing extraordinary circumstances. David's case became a catalyst for broader conversations about the intersection of human services and legal systems, demonstrating that sometimes the most important justice happens when formal rules give way to fundamental humanity. By the end of the week, what had begun as a simple traffic citation had evolved into a movement that would influence how communities support their most vulnerable members for years to come. 3 months later, as autumn leaves painted Providence in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Emma Martinez passed away peacefully in her father's arms, surrounded by a community that had become her extended family through their shared journey of love and loss. Her final weeks had been filled not with the despair of financial worry, but with the joy of knowing that hundreds of strangers had chosen to care about her story and support her family's fight. The funeral processions stretched for blocks through the working-class neighborhoods of Providence as construction workers, court personnel, fellow parents, and people who had never met Emma came to honor a little girl whose courage had touched an entire city. Judge Caprio delivered a eulogy that celebrated not just Emma's brief but meaningful life, but the way her story had revealed the extraordinary capacity for goodness that exists within ordinary people. David stood with quiet dignity, his grief immense, but no longer carrying the additional burden of financial desperation that had once threatened to crush his spirit. Carmen held her brother's hand as they walked behind the small white casket, both of them overwhelmed by the love that surrounded them, even in their darkest hour. The legacy Emma left behind wasn't just in the hearts of those who loved her, but in the transformed understanding of what community support could accomplish when people chose compassion over indifference. The courtroom where David's story first unfolded became a symbol of hope for families facing impossible circumstances, with Judge Caprio's approach inspiring judicial reforms that prioritized human dignity alongside legal procedure. Law schools across the country began incorporating the Martinez case into their curricula, teaching future lawyers and judges that the most powerful legal decisions sometimes required setting aside legal precedent in favor of fundamental human decency. The Providence Municipal Court established the Emma Martinez Family Support Fund, providing emergency assistance to defendants whose legal troubles stemmed from medical crises or family emergencies. Other jurisdictions began implementing similar programs, recognizing that addressing root causes of legal violations often served justice better than traditional punitive measures. Judge Caprio received the National Humanitarian Award for his role in demonstrating how legal institutions could become forces for healing rather than mere punishment. The video of David's courtroom revelation continued to be shared years later, serving as a reminder that behind every case file was a human story deserving of compassion and understanding. The simple act of one judge choosing mercy over protocol had created ripple effects that would influence legal practice and community support systems for generations to come. David eventually returned to construction work, but his experience had transformed him into an advocate for other families facing pediatric cancer diagnoses, using his story to raise funds and awareness for childhood cancer research. He established Emma's Garden, a memorial fund that provided financial assistance to families whose children were receiving treatment at the same hospital where Emma had fought her brave battle. The construction company where he worked created a formal policy allowing employees facing family medical emergencies to receive paid leave and community support, setting an example that spread throughout Providence's business community. Carmen became a volunteer coordinator for the hospital's family support program, channeling her grief into ensuring that no parent would have to choose between being present for their child and meeting basic financial obligations. The Martinez family's story continued to inspire acts of kindness throughout Providence, from neighbors checking on elderly residents to teachers creating emergency funds for students facing hardship. Judge Caprio often spoke about how Emma's story had reminded him why he had chosen law as a profession, not to punish people for their worst moments, but to recognize their humanity even in the midst of their struggles. The little girl who had never set foot in a courtroom had somehow managed to transform the very nature of justice in her community. Years later, when people asked Judge Caprio about the most meaningful case of his career, he would always return to that October morning when David Martinez stood before his bench, carrying unbearable grief and expecting only judgment. The story had become part of Providence folklore, told and retold, as an example of what was possible when institutions remembered their fundamental purpose of serving human dignity. New judges were sworn in beneath a plaque that read, "Justice tempered with mercy," donated by the Martinez family as a permanent reminder that legal authority should always be exercised with compassion. The courthouse steps, where so many had gathered to support David's family, became a place where community members continued to organize relief efforts for neighbors in crisis. Emma's story lived on in every act of kindness it had inspired, every family that received support during their darkest hour, and every moment when someone chose empathy over indifference. Judge Caprio's legacy was measured not in the thousands of cases he had decided, but in the single moment when he had shown the world that true justice begins with recognizing the sacred humanity in every person who stands before the bench. The little girl who had lost her battle with cancer had somehow won a much larger war against cynicism, proving that even in the face of ultimate loss, love remained the most powerful force in any courtroom. Emma Martinez's story reminds us that true justice isn't found in rulebooks, but in the courage to choose compassion when it matters most. Judge Caprio showed us that sometimes the greatest verdicts are written not with gavels, but with hearts. What did this story mean to you? Subscribe and share your thoughts below.